A lot of people have joined. Welcome to the BSA. My name is Yorgos Moratidis. I'm the Assistant Director of the British School at Athens. And it is a great pleasure to see so many people joined for the first BSA French lecture this academic year. And for those unfamiliar with the work of the school, the BSA is a UK-based charity whose object is to conduct, facilitate, and promote research in Greece in all periods and across all arts and humanities and social sciences disciplines. And we do this mainly from Athens, our main base, as well as a smaller research center at Knossos on Crete and an office in London. At the moment, what you're looking at is a screenshot of our website, which I strongly encourage you to visit and explore what we do, and hopefully also to consider signing up to our mailing list to receive information about our activities, including future events and seminars like this one today, and perhaps to consider to become one of our supporters, which goes a long way. So before I hand over to Nigel Spencer, a few protocols that will, I hope, help the event run smoothly. So first of all, as you've realized now, other than the speaker and hosts, all microphones and cameras are off by default. But throughout the talk, you have two features available. The chat feature, which looks like a speech bubble, and which allows you to type text, which can be read by other participants, as well as the lecturer and the host. And you can use this if you have any issue, and my co-host, Flora Michelaki, will try her best to assist. Otherwise, feel free to comment to each other during the talk. But for the most part, the host and the speaker will ignore chat comments. But they will not ignore the Q&A feature that looks like two speech bubbles, one on top of the other, into which you can type questions for the speaker. And through this feature, only you, the speaker, and the host can see the comment, the question. After the lecture finishes, Nigel will read out a selection of questions received, and our speaker will have the opportunity to respond. You should also see a small window in top right of your screen. If this gets in your way, you can mouse over it and either move it around your screen, or you can click on the bars above it to make it smaller. And with this, I hope everything is clear. The Q&A protocol will be repeated at some point at the end of the lecture. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Nigel to introduce the speaker for the day.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Yorgo, and a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you very much for the introduction. Flora, thank you for your help setting everything up as well. So my name's Nigel Spencer. I'm currently the chair of the Friends of the BSA. As many of you will know, we support the BSA and its wider aims and all the research it does, and all its academic and educational aims by organising these regular lectures and by trips to Greece, which we run every other year. You can help, and we do these events as fundraising events. They're obviously available to you, but if any of you would like to make a donation, that is really gratefully received, and we would like to just emphasise that. And I think yes, a link's just gone in. Thank you, Flora, for that as well. They do make a huge difference because obviously for all the research needs we have, helping the students and helping school teachers and people get interested in the subject. So there is a future pipeline of people who will develop into the classicists and classical archaeologists and scientists of tomorrow as well. So all our work is designed to help that future aspect of the BSA's work. I'm just going to say a few words now to introduce this afternoon's talk. You can see the title there on the slide, From the Stone Age to the Cistercians, Arcadian Stymphalos Through the Ages. And I'm really, it's wonderful to introduce a colleague from Canada and from many years ago who I've known. So Hector Williams, Professor Emeritus Hector Williams, who's kindly giving the talk this afternoon. Hector and I met in '89. We were just remembering it was I was helping, Hector was already doing the excavations at Mytilene, which was my area of study, as some of you will know. My research is all around Lesbos, Mytilene, and the island there. So Hector was excavating there. But Hector, let me give a broader background of Hector because he has such amazingly wide interest and experience. He's Professor Emeritus of Greek art and archaeology in the Department for Ancient Mediterranean Near Eastern Studies at the University of British Columbia. So it's morning for Hector, where he's dialing in from. I know it's afternoon or evening for where many of us are dialing in from. Hector's worked in the Aegean for over 40 years. Directs the work of the university at Mytilene, as I mentioned, and at Stymphalos, which obviously we've got the talk today about, his wonderful and really fascinating work here that's very broad, and I think that's one thing we're going to really have a joy of hearing about this afternoon. And he's also publishing material from Anamurim in Turkey. Hector's worked in his career at many other sites, ranging from Kenkreis, University of Chicago's work there, University of Pennsylvania's work at Gothic. He's been in many other countries, and also Hector has a real interest in maritime archaeology as well. So Underwater Archaeology Society in British Columbia. And that interest and that theme continues into some of the roles he's been trustee and sort of chair and president of. Past president and trustee of the Vancouver Maritime Museum, chairs its collections committee, and he's been involved with the Canadian Archaeological Institute for many, many years, the Institute at Athens, where he's on the board, Vancouver Society, the Archaeological Institute of America as well, and has also been involved in, and is vice president too, and the founding member of Pharos, the Canadian Hellenic Cultural Society of Vancouver as well. So Hector, as you and I have discussed over the last few weeks, I'm so pleased you're able to do this afternoon. Thank you so much. And I'm going to put myself on mute at this point, as Yorgos, as you said, I'll be looking at the chat, and I'll come back at the end and we can have some questions. But yeah, Hector, over to yourself to tell us about a really interestingly broad period of time at Stymphalos. And I think that's what's very interesting here, the breadth of time and also the different methods you've been using to look at this site as well. So Hector, over to you. Thank you so much. And to tell us about Stymphalos. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor to be able to talk to you today about this work. In particular, it's appropriate talking to a BSA audience because so many people from the BSA have been involved in our project right from the beginning, both academic and graduate students. Our geophysical work, for example, would not have been possible without people from the BSA itself. Richard Jones was with us first, and people from Bradford and people from York, whom I'll mention in the course of the talk. Also, we have members of our staff working at the BSA, like Alice Clinch, on the painted wall plaster. There's enough actually to give a whole morning of talk, so I'm going to have to speed up to get through it. Next slide, please. Stymphalos is where the arrow is, where the star is. There you can see Lake Stymphalos up in the northern Peloponnese, the northeastern corner of Arcadia. It was a tiny town, a few thousand people, only a bit over a kilometer across, and would probably be not known to anybody except Hellenistic historians. And there's not much about it in the Hellenistic historians if it were not for Herakles and the Stymphalian birds. You can see, though, it is way up in the northeastern corner of Arcadia. It's on the main route from Arcadia and, more importantly, perhaps Laconia, down to the coast. And while there was a Bronze Age presence at Stymphalos, it really didn't seem to get going until the 6th century, although we have very little information about that. What we do know, and what we've been digging, is that by the middle of the 4th century, a whole new grid plan town was set up there. Next, please. It's a dramatic landscape with Mount Kyllini rising to the northwest and the broad basin of the valley of Stymphalos. It's about 10 miles in length and 4 or 5 miles across. Not a huge area, but very well watered, as you can see from this winter photograph, and also very rich agriculturally. Next, please. I put this one in for Nigel, since Mytilene was his home and native land for a time.
Thank you, Hector.
We have been working there, as we have at Stymphalos since 1982, sometimes both sites in a season. So it is a very different sort of city from Stymphalos. It was one of the great cities of ancient Greece, a very rich cultural background and history. A huge city, well over a mile across. You can see the theater at the bottom and the castle at the other end where we've been digging the sanctuary of Demeter. But it was interesting to balance the two. Large modern city of 50,000 people, major city of the ancient Greek world, as opposed to a tiny city of relatively little importance, tucked off in the mountains of Arcadia, not quite off the beaten track, but certainly not in the center of things. Next, please. We have drawings going back to around 1800 by the English watercolorist Edward Dodwell, who left this view of Mount Kyllini and the lake from the southeast. Stymphalos is over there on the other side of the lake. There was a sprinkling of habitation there, grew in the 19th century, but it never amounted to a very large population. Next, please. Herakles, as I said, was the famous figure there. It was the sixth of his labors, killing the Stymphalian birds or driving them away. There are two versions of the story. And if it weren't for that, I doubt that many people would know the name or location of Stymphalos and the eponymous lake that it sits on its north shore. Next, please. Now, Stymphalos was proud of their hero, and he appears on their coins, but they seem to have been proud of their birds too, because here, mid-4th century coin, we find Herakles on one side and the head of the bird on the other. Artemis was the principal divinity there, and Artemis and Herakles appear above. One of the striking features of Stymphalos is the religion there, and the remains of temples and sanctuaries are a bit cloudy. I mean, for example, we know from an inscription that there was a sanctuary of Brauronian Artemis, which is an Athenian cult at Stymphalos, and what it's doing there is still something of a mystery. Next, please. Well, there is a view from the mountains, from Apellephron over to the southeast and pass over to central Arcadia, runs in that area. The arrow points to the ancient site on the north shore of the lake, and you can see the lake, which sadly is quickly becoming a marsh now, siga, as the reeds are taking it over. That's a whole talk in itself, which I'll leave, but it is a problem because the reeds are gradually encroaching on the site itself, and their roots can do enormous damage. Next, please. The site more or less falls off the map after the middle of the 2nd century BCE, when Rome overruns the northern part of the Peloponnese in the Third Achaean War. Stymphalos was probably collateral damage in that. We'll come to that later. But later on, and Pausanias tells us this in the mid-2nd century, the Emperor Hadrian built an aqueduct from Stymphalos to take the waters, the abundant waters from there down to Corinth. And Yannis Lolas, who's studied with us, has studied and published the aqueduct, and you can see the line of it, almost see it running across the plain there. This is, of course, a great benefit, but a bit of a curse, because the Corinthia has been poaching the waters of Stymphalos for well over 130 years now. Next, please. The site basically is abandoned by the mid-6th century of the Christian era, to judge from what we found, and there is only a very small Byzantine presence. But interestingly, in around 1225, Cistercians from a mother house in in France come and establish a monastery that flourishes there from about 1225 to 1270. And my colleague Sheila Campbell from the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto excavated and published the site there. It deserves a whole lecture in itself. The arrow in the middle points down to the remains of the Gothic church and the rest of the monastery, which lies under the fields there. The ancient city lies to the south of it, about a kilometer away, and you can see the arrow pointing down to the Acropolis, the line of the city wall coming down from there. Next, please. The lake itself frequently floods the entire site in winter, although not so much now that so much water is being taken down to the Corinthia, both for use there and for their baricoques, their apricots. But this picture is taken from some time ago before the reeds became so extensive. I was first up there in 1968 when I was a graduate student eating at Kenkriai. Our photographer wanted to get pictures of the dawn over Lake Stymphalos, so we drove up in September, and that was when I realized that there were features there that we'll come to that made it a very interesting site. The lake itself is fascinating. It is a Pulgi, shallow lake set in karstic limestone. The work that's been done by two teams and one individual in the last 20 years told a lot about it, but still much to learn. They've drilled cores into the lake, discovered there is an impermeable layer of clay, so the lake can never be more than about 2 meters deep. But the lake itself is fascinating. There's a tiny fish there that is only found in Lake Stymphalos, and somehow it survives even when the lake dries up, which it does from time to time. But in the winter, and occasionally in antiquity, it would flood the entire site. This is looking along north from the Acropolis. Next, please. Now, how did the city survive? Why is it there? Well, I think its principal purpose was to block Spartan aggression moving up from Laconia through Arcadia down to the coast. Stymphalos was famous for its mercenaries. Aeneas Tacticus, the military writer, probably came from Stymphalos. There was a Stymphalian general in the mercenary forces that went with Cyrus and, of course, Xenophon to what is now Iraq in 399. And this seems to have been a tradition there. Mercenaries, if they did well, did quite well. And we find for a small town, Stymphalos had some remarkable structures. We found 2 sets, for example, of marble roof tiles. We have 2 large Doric temples, not in the city itself, but one to the north and one to the south. We have a substantial number of remains of other Doric buildings. But I mean, think of it, how many temples are there in Greece with marble roof tiles? And to have 2 in a poor little valley says that something very interesting is going on. Well, the Stymphalian mercenaries seem to have traveled all over the place. We found coins from Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, Macedonia, Sicily, even Carthage. Dr. Robert Weir, our numismatist, has done a great job pulling all this together. Next, please. Should mention that the first excavations at Stymphalos were done by Anastasios Orlandos, the great Greek archaeologist, between 1924 and 1930. And it was with the permission of the Archaeologiki Eteria, the Archaeological Society, that we were allowed to do work as a synergesia between 1982 and 1984. Professor George Milanas expedited that, and we later had great help, cooperation from Professor Petrakos, who became the Genikos Grammateas after Professor Milanas. So it's not just been the BSA, but Greek archaeologists and archaeological institutions involved as well. Professor Stavros Papamarionopoulos was one of our geophysicists right from the start, for example. think he's recently retired from Patra. Well, the site didn't have much else happening in it. I put this in because the contrast, we've got an early Bronze Age Celt and a fine grain stone, found two of those. My colleague Jerry Schaus found them in his excavations. But on the other side, those of you of military mind may recognize a cartridge from a British 303 Lee Enfield rifle. This is the kind of thing that archaeologists love to have to data level, because on the bottom of the cartridge, it's inscribed Birmingham Small Arms 1943. So this was part of the military supplies dropped by the British to the Antarctic, to the guerrillas who were very active in the area. And this may be left over from the Battle of Stymphalia in July of 1944. And that's all I can say about that for now. Next, please. As I say, there are little stories everywhere here. The earliest thing we found on the site was unfortunately not in context. It was in a road fill, but it was a Neanderthal hand axe, at least 100,000 years before Christ. And those karstic caves in the area could well have housed Neanderthals. And then a bit of Bronze Age stonework, handful, maybe a dozen or so late Bronze Age sherds, small amount of 6th and 5th century sherds, indicating presence there then, although there was probably one earlier. And then the founding of the classical city, which we've been digging after the Spartan defeats at Leuctra and especially Mantinea in 362, when a whole new grid plan town went up there. Now, this is what caught my eye in 1968 when I was up there. I could see from the parch marks that there were regular lines of walls, both of buildings and of roads. And nobody had realized that there was a grid plan city there. At that time, there were relatively few grid plan cities known in Greece. Now there are lots because people have been looking out for them. But it's part of the so-called Hippodamian system of town planning, which really becomes the rule in the Greek world, both in the motherland and beyond into the Near East. It was very much subject to the powers of the day. The Macedonians captured the city in the late 4th century. We find improvements in the fortifications, with artillery towers going in at that point. Things come and go for the next 200 years. The city, perhaps not thriving, but certainly doing reasonably well. And then around 146, we get the Romans arriving, the Achaean War, the destruction of Corinth, and the abandonment to a large degree. There may have been a few settlers still left there at Stymphalos. Now, we have very little in the way of historical sources, very little in the way of epigraphic sources. So the archaeology is telling us a lot. For example, we did not know that there was a partial resettlement in the late 1st century BCE. Perhaps they were Augustan veterans from the Battle of Actium and other campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean by Octavian, later Augustus. And that seems to come to an end, an earthquake about 40. Small presence later tested by pottery and lamps and a few coins. And then between the 4th and the mid-6th century, a sprinkling of Byzantine graves. We have not found houses, settlements to go with these graves. We found 5 Byzantine cemeteries, however, and I'll be talking about some of the scientific work going on the bones a bit later. Next, please. There are remains apparent besides park mark there. For example, on the south side of the Acropolis, you can see this ancient roadway with wheel ruts cut into it there, going up to the top. That's the typical limestone of the area. Next, please. City itself, although as I say, we found 2 sets of marble roof tiles, probably Parian marble. The city itself was built basically of rubble foundations with a mud brick superstructure and tiled roofs on top of that. But you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, the very visible parch marks in areas that hadn't been plowed about 30 years ago. there. So it was clear from that. And if you look way over to the upper left corner, you can see a 6-meter wide road with the remains of drainage ditches, darker green down either side. We have this across the city, a whole series of north-south roads, and then 3 or 4 major east-west avenues. We were one of the first, if not the first, geophysical survey of the city in Greece in 1983 and 1984, done with fairly simple equipment. Show a printout. This was an old Epson HX20 adding machine tape, which we glued the various pieces together. But it shows very clearly, again, the orthogonal layout of the city and buildings with courtyards, small ones, houses, larger ones, perhaps something like a gymnasium. Next, please. One of the odd things about Stymphalos is, in spite of all our work there, we've yet to find the agora. We presume there was one there somewhere. It's not the easiest place to work. Most of the site is privately owned, and we've been fortunate that farmers had more or less abandoned the fields near the lake, so we were able to dig them. Some question whether they were owned by the state or by the individual, but that's not an issue at the moment. But you can see olive and walnut trees growing there. There's wine, grapevines as well. But you can also see the plowing, often deep plowing going on, tearing up the ancient buildings. And with the introduction of tractor-drawn plows around 1970, 1971, the destruction continued to grow. So we were very pleased when we got permission to start doing some salvage work before things were completely obliterated there. And I must say we've had a lot of help and cooperation from the local people and from the village of Stymphalia, and indeed the Demos before it was rolled into the Demos of Sicyon. Next, please. The geophysical work was perhaps the most important of our early scientific endeavors at the site. This is a crew from the University of York, led by Ben Gourley, who's a Canadian who taught at York and moved back to Canada, who was able to bring students and equipment, flux gate gradiometers over there on the left and resistivity meter on the right to extend the relatively limited area that we did originally. Originally, everything, all the numbers had to be written down and then put into the computer. Of course, now they can be programmed instantaneously into recording devices, which saves an enormous amount of time. What took us an hour can be done in 20 minutes now. Next, please. This is just a sample of their work. It's an overlap gate there over on the left side, both before the data had been cleaned up and afterward. And you can see the two walls overlapping with the round tower at the end. There is nothing visible on the surface here. The remains that you see there are half a meter to a meter below the surface. And you can see an east-west road running across there with actually a pair of roads with some remains around. This area has been heavily harvested, however, heavily plowed, and so the remains are much less well preserved than they are in other areas of the city. Next, please. The plan of the city here, this was done initially in 1982 by Dr. Thomas Boyd, who was our architect at our excavations in Anamurium in Cilicia, and then worked with us at Stymphalos for 2 seasons. And he and Rob Loader, an English architectural student, actually he's Canadian, but being educated in England, made this plan. It was done with the old-fashioned optical theodolite and 30-meter tape. So it was a labor of love working in July in the hot fields, putting all these pieces together. And from them, we built up more of the plan using the geophysical evidence. But you can see the outline of a sort of triangular city. The lake is at the bottom there. Where there's a star, there is a large gate that was rebuilt around 300 when the Macedonians had conquered Stymphalos to improve the defenses of the city. You can see the roads running up. Running up from the gate, there's an 8-meter wide road. Otherwise, they're 6 meters. And then we'll take a look at some of the different areas. We excavated 15 different areas of Stymphalos. We often had between 70 and 75 volunteers, local workmen, graduate students, professional staff there. So moved a lot of dirt, and we're still getting it published now, thanks to my colleagues in particular. Next, please. There's a plan of the Phlius Gate, because the city of Phlius is a few dozen kilometers to the east. You can see it has a big courtyard. It's very similar to the so-called Arcadian Gate at Messini, built again about the same time, 360 or so, after the defeat of the Spartans and the rebuilding of or the building of a new capital for the free Messenians. So we think that this came in because this was the state-of-the-art fortifications at that time. We'll see it elsewhere on the site. Next, please. We'll just take a quick look around them. There's the mountains of Arcadia, Kylini rising up 2,800 meters, the heights above the home of Pan. I must admit I've never been to the top, but my colleague Jerry Schaus has been up several times. And it's a practicable hike. What we're seeing here, however, is the Acropolis Tower. Again, at the end of the 4th century, the Macedonians installed a large artillery tower where there had been a relatively small rectangular tower before as part of the new defenses of the city. And it all goes in with the place of Stymphalos as a center for mercenaries. And the population, much of the time there must have been mostly old men, women, and children, the way it is or used to be in many Greek villages where all the young men had gone off to Canada, States, Australia to work. I remember going to Emeritus on Carpathos, my first visit to Greece in 1965, and there were only 3 or 4 young men who all had come back from the United States to find wives in the village and then move back with them. And you sort of have the feeling it might have been like that at Stymphalos with the men folk away. And of course, travel took a lot longer in those days. Next, please. There's a restoration by Ben of the tower. We don't know the exact details. It's a thick stone foundation, about 2 meters thick, with room for 2 stories, each mounting catapults of one sort or another. We have no remains of catapults. They're extremely rare, but we do have dozens of catapult bolts that were fired at different times and perhaps different circumstances. On the other side is the plan of the tower, and you can see how thick the walls are. It was later used from the mid-4th to the mid-5th century as a family cemetery in the late Roman, early Byzantine world. And we found 5 of these, and we think they're probably all family cemeteries, although we haven't been able to do DNA. We don't have the funds for it. Work to compare the skeletons, although we have done other work on them, as you'll hear. This one was interesting because there was even a dog burial in it. We also found a puppy burial elsewhere on the Acropolis with the drinking cup of around 300 BCE. Seems to have been a sacrifice in the foundations of a building. Next, please. The most important area that we dug, however, was a sanctuary. Now, the sanctuary had always been visible. Orlandos had done some clearing there, presented a simple plan of the temple, and mentioned an inscription, Polyad, that he found in the area, which led him, and indeed us, to think it was Athena, Polias. So it was a sanctuary of Athena. But a lot more complicated than that. And Jerry Schaus, who directed the work in this area, did a masterful job herding cats, putting a dozen of us together to write this book on the Acropolis Sanctuary. He did the bulk of the writing, but various of us contributed chapters. And kite photograph by Ben Gurley or Richard Anderson, I've forgotten which it was, who were both, of course, Richard went on to become the architect of the Athenian Agora, but was with us for 2 seasons up there. And you can see the temple there at the top, 2 subsidiary buildings, a big one beside it, altar in front, and a smaller one down toward the edge of the Acropolis. Next, please. There's a view of it after the excavations. Again, it's mud brick superstructure, tile roofs, small temple about 11 meters long, which seems to have had its floor left with patches of bedrock still evident in it. The remains were remarkably rich, and I'll show a sample of them in a moment. The next, please. There's a plan of it, the temple there on the left, and then just above building A was a building perhaps used, well, Orlando thought it might be a priest's house. It might have been a building where the priests or priestesses lived, may have been a place, certainly was a place, I think, where banqueting took place, hundreds of drinking vessels from there, for example, and a lot of other pottery too. But some very curious things up at the top there, in the top left, you'll see a letters stelae. There are a series of 5 aniconic stone slabs that were buried there that seem to have been part of the dedications around the sanctuary. Next, please. There is a reconstruction done by the Museum of the Environment at Stymphalia's computer people, showing in a very approximate way the temple, the altar, and the building A. The Piraeus Bank Foundation did a magnificent job on the museum, and even though it's a museum of the environment, they gave us a corner of it to display some of our finds, especially those relating to the environment. And you'll have to make the trip up there, like Popo. It's well worth it. Only 2.5-hour drive from Athens, 2 hours if you are a taxi driver. Next, please. There is a view of the temple from the east. Orlando's didn't fair all of it. He didn't realize, for example, that there was a flight of steps going up on the eastern side, nor that there was the cutting for a periranterion, a holy water basin there where the arrow is pointing. Next, please. This is one down in the museum at Isthmia. We found fragments of a number of these holy water basins that were in use in the sanctuary. Perhaps they broke easily and had to be replaced. But we were able to recover a lot of animal bones that Deborah Sillo published in Jerry Schaus's big volume. So we know a lot about what was going on there in terms of animal sacrifice. Next, please. There's a view showing what it might have looked like inside with the mud brick walls. We found remains of painted red plaster that covered at least the lower walls on the interior, and inside there were a number of fragmentary pieces of sculpture that we'll look at next. Next, please. The identification, however, was up in the air. I mean, we were finding hundreds of dedications appropriate to women, jewelry in particular, loom weights, things like that. So we thought, well, perhaps it is Artemis after all, although we had no certain proof of that. And then Jerry, as he was going through the many small finds, found two inscriptions, including this bronze rib fragment with Eleithia, Eleithia, the goddess of childbirth, on it. So this appears to have been a sanctuary to that goddess. Not a lot of sanctuaries to her. She's often assimilated with Artemis, but that discovery made us wonder then, well, where is the temple of Artemis that Pausanias mentioned? Was it one of the two big Doric temples found in the area? But they weren't actually in the city, so there's still something of a mystery there. Next, please. Another mystery is why the statuary was so smashed up. First, we found it, we thought, well, maybe it was the early Christians that found it and did a number on the pagan remains when they were putting a couple of early Christian burials in there, but realized no, this was in context of the mid-2nd century, and you can see the souvlaki sticks are indicating the various pieces. The next, please, and you can see just how smashed up the statuary was. Most important piece was a cori. We have much of or good part of the lower part of the statue. We have the hand with a rabbit in it. We have a bit of the shoulder, a bit of the breast, with a hole in it where there was probably some jewelry attached, and so on. Mary Sturgeon published this in the Stymphalos Sanctuary volume, and she thinks it dates to late Archaic, say around 500, Parian marble, possibly by an Athenian sculptor. Well, what's it doing in a temple 150 years later? We don't know. My guess is that perhaps those Stymphalian mercenaries were serving in the army of Athens, and they brought back a second-hand archaic statue to set up in their new temple. But we really don't know for sure. Next, please. But it wasn't just the core that we found, but another piece, probably 150 to 200 years later than the core, that was a temple boy. And those of you who've been to Brauron, know these are very common in the sanctuary of Artemis there. There's a complete one, I think it might be from Cyprus here, and it shows one of these fudgy little boys that were set up in sanctuaries of Artemis. You can see from the remains of the buttocks that the statuary had been heavily burned. See burn marks on the preserved surface, and then the black marks where the fire reached. What happened there, we simply do not know. Next, please. But the amount of jewelry is remarkable, well over 200 pieces of different sorts. Very little of it valuable, most of it of bronze, offerings from the women of the city in payment for, in thanks to the goddess for successful childbirth or pregnancy. This is one of the few bigger pieces. It's a piece of gold foil, and you can perhaps make out Eros on the left, kissing Psyche below him, a little roundel of this famous legend of Eros and Psyche. Next, please. We also found fragments. For example, the gold rosette there is broken away from a wreath, and there are complete ones with similar rosettes from Macedonian burials up in northern Greece, and we suspect that when the Romans plundered it, they probably tore some of these things apart to share them, and bits and found them. The other side, there is a gilded silver head of the goddess of Medusa. By the way, I just got a notice on my screen that my internet is unstable, so I hope it holds on for us. Next, please. Largest amount of jewelry was bronze earrings. There were 122 of them from the sanctuary, and those are some lunate ones you can see there. There were also rings. For example, there's a silver ring with an eros on it. They're all published in the Stymphalos sanctuary volume. Next, please. The other interesting find in quantity in the sanctuary was the projectile point. And some of these are from arrows, but a number of them are from catapults. And it was in the 4th century BCE that catapults began to become increasingly common and a regular part of Greek defenses and indeed Greek sieges. And we think these were fired in possibly, but not certainly, during the Macedonian siege of the late, I think 315 BCE, or possibly during the Roman attack on the city. But when I say Roman attack, we really are not sure what the Romans did there. We had no evidence of Roman activity there, in fact, until our excavations. So there are still mysteries here. Next, please. Well, how do we know that the smoking gun points at the Romans? Because our numismatist, Robert Weir, identified a counterfeit Roman coin of 149 BCE. It wasn't from the sanctuary, it was from the domestic area of the city. We'll come to shortly. But you can make out the false copper core of the coin and then the silver wash that had been put over it. Forging coins was not uncommon in the Roman world, and this had presumably been forged in Rome itself and sent over with pay for the Roman legions that were in Greece. And when it began to wear off, the owner in disgust just threw it away, and we found it. But the moneyers' names are on it in Latin. And that's why we know it was 149. So it would have taken probably a couple of years to make its way over to Greece. And it is the real evidence we have for the Roman army being there, because this kind of coinage was almost always used in the Eastern Mediterranean just to pay the Roman army. Next, please. And pottery. Well, again, if one were a pottery fan, you could enjoy a whole hour's talk on this. Jerry has been working on the molded bowls, which there are over 100, especially from that building that we think was for dining beside the temple. But there's a lot of other pottery as well being published by Megan Daniels, my colleague. And I just show this bowl here, reticulated bowl, to show sample once it had been mended up. Next, please. But the story doesn't end there. We found amid the debris Corinthian lamps of the 1st and 2nd centuries, and possibly early 3rd after Christ. These Bernier type 16 wheel-made lamps down below, for example. We have nearly a dozen of them from this site and others in the city. So clearly people were using them during the Roman resettlement. And that the sanctuary possibly continued in use with lamps being left as votives, typical from the one at the top there, which is not one of ours, which are extremely fragmentary. It's one from Corinth, but it shows the type of lamps from the later 2nd into the 3rd century. So there was some activity there. We found one coin of Septimius Severus in the abbey, in fact, So I'm glad that we can indicate some continuity there, although it must have been a very small number of people living. Still, the place was well located. You could be down to the coast in a day. You could climb over the mountains to Arcadia and across the Peloponnese in the other direction with not enormous effort. Next, please. Well, now over to the settlement area. This is the southeastern part of the site. It's another of Ben's kite photographs. You can see the encroaching reeds of the lake inexorably taking over the site. The site was very difficult to dig because the water level was so high. We only had one season where we could go deeper than about 50 centimeters. Otherwise, we got into groundwater and mud. But there you can see our biggest area of excavation. This was a domestic area with houses of the late Classical-Hellenistic period. And then, somewhat to our surprise, a couple of early Roman houses or villas, if you want to call them that. And that's the east end of the Acropolis you see on the right-hand side of the picture. We're looking south. Next, please. So there's a view. We're down there by the water. We know there was a large seasonal stream, almost a river, coming in on the north side of the city. You see that over on the right-hand side, and water channels here and there around. The area we've been focusing on mostly because it's the land is available there is down on the south side of the city by the ancient water line. Next, please. There's a view of the area that we dug. It looks impressive, but in fact, because we could only do the surface levels down half a meter, we do not have a lot of stratigraphic evidence there. Otherwise, it was all water. But we do have roads. We do have Hellenistic houses, and then, as I mentioned, the Roman houses. Next, please. There's a closer site photograph. You can see the foundations of these houses. That's why it was necessary to chart them geophysically or surface remains, because the plowing with these big tractor-drawn plows were just tearing them out of the ground. You can see piles of stone here and there where the farmers have destroyed ancient buildings and heaped them up. They're not supposed to plow very deeply, but there's no guard at the site, so pretty well anything can happen there. But you can get a good idea of the range of the walls, and you have to imagine the mud brick, probably often plastered and painted on top of them. Next, please. There's a plan. The arrows point down two of these 6-meter roads, which were built over when the early Roman settlers moved in. But the roads themselves are interesting. They're 4 or 5 strata. We had the one season when it was dry enough to dig down a meter. So we have strata going back to the mid-4th century for the roads. One interesting phase later on was where they paved the road with large broken sherds. Wasn't paved with gravel or with stone, but sherds to keep their feet dry in winter. Next, please. I'm going to talk now about the 2 Roman houses. They probably were separate houses, although it could have been a sort of extended family with the parents on one side and the kids and their family on the other. But we have a Roman courtyard house with a well right in the very middle. You can see there, and the road is actually encroached on, as you can see the road is encroached on by the house, which is in that area. And let me go back to the next photograph, please. There we go. This is a smaller one. Then the next, please. We knew that the site was destroyed in an earthquake because, as the previous slide showed, there were complete vessels, but ones that had been smashed as their shelves came tumbling down to break them up on the floor. Next, please. More important, though, was the large house across the street from it, which was built around a courtyard with painted wall plaster and a lot of very interesting finds. The next, please. One room, for example, an andron, Ben's dining room, had ashlar masonry imitation with painted plaster, which you can see there. And this work is being studied by Alice Clinch, who's been doing XRF studies of it with equipment from the British School to determine how it was made up. Next, please. And there's a possible reconstruction. The details are debatable, but at least it gives you an idea of what the original might have looked like. Next, please. Spectacular was the discovery of a door and door bosses in this area. The whole area, by the way, was under the direction of Dr. Susan Marie Cronkite Price, who was a PhD from the Institute of Archaeology in London. And her care was very much appreciated with details like this. You can see them as they're emerging. The next, please. And those are what they look like. I show a Macedonian door, 2nd century over there. This is not typically Roman, even if it's in a Roman house. So they must have found an old door that they reused with these different kinds of bosses on it. Next, please. And who lived there? Well, we wouldn't know, except we found a shield and a sword, and not a gladius, a normal Roman legionary sword, but a spada, a cavalry sword. So I suspect it was a cavalry officer from one of Octavian or Augustus later's legions who was settled up there. Next, please. And there were bits and pieces. I mean, Hellenistic, the crowning element of a Hellenistic funerary monument there at the top, or two big lion's foot table supports there at the bottom. This was a family with money and pretensions. The next, please. The earthquake happened around 37 to 39. We have coins of Gaius of Caligula issued in Corinth from the area. We have several hundred coins from the site. Connections especially ran to nearby Corinth, Phlius, and Sicyon. And the next, please. It imported Italian terra sigillata and local Peloponnesian copies of Italian lamps, again around the early 1st century BCE there, and then the middle century down with the lamp. Next, please. And some very, very odd things, hundreds of mussel shells and a bag of sponges. Of course, sponges were used as toilet paper by the Romans. That may be why they were up there. I mean, we're only about an 8-hour walk down to the coast, so this stuff could be brought up donkey back quite easily. Whether the mussels were delicacies for diners when the weather wasn't too hot, or as Jerry recently suggested, perhaps they were broken up and mixed in with mortar. We're still working on that. And the next, please. And then finally, two other areas that we worked on. An area that Orlando's called the Agora, but seems to have been a sanctuary, and a theater. Next, please. There is this area cut out of the rock, and in it is a fountain, a monumental propylon, and a thalos, a Hellenistic or late classical or Hellenistic imitation of a Mycenaean tomb. Next, please. And there's a view of it from above. And you can see the round part of the building with the long dromos going into it. It's not Mycenaean, although there is Mycenaean in the area. You see the fountain there behind it. It's a fascinating structure and almost without parallel. Next, please. There's a view of the treasury of Atreus to give you an idea of where we're getting the similarity. And the next, please. The fountain house, which sometimes is full of water and sometimes dries up, but never dries up completely, and it's cold, fresh water coming out of the mountains. And you can see the reeds in the background moving in. This was 20 years ago. Next, please. Another view of the fountain itself, which we hope someday will be restored. Next, please. And the theater, this was a total surprise. We had a big area of rock-cut seating at the end of the Acropolis, but we found through geophysical survey and through parch marks a large scene building in 1999 of the theater of the city. We weren't able to dig it all because of watery conditions, but you can see it there. And the next, please, shows the actual view of it and the rock cut seating would hold 400 or 500 people easily up there. And there are the foundations. But it's not an ordinary theater. It's a theater that was rebuilt. The next, please. You can see there that the first stage up above, perhaps around 300. We're not really sure of the date because the wet conditions make stratigraphy difficult. And then it was expanded with a raised scene building and probably looked very much like this theater at Priene in Asia Minor. We're still working on the details of it. And the next, please. A clepsydra, a water clock. We'll have to skip over that. Next, please. We're almost at the end. And the graves and gravestones. We found about a dozen Hellenistic gravestones, which were published in ZPE, but never the graves. They were plowed up north of the village by farmers in their fields. It's probably where the big late classical Hellenistic cemetery was. And then we found 5 late Roman, early Byzantine cemeteries around the city. And what is important there is the work that's been going on. Next, please. It's the last slide. Is the scientific work analyzing the strontium residues in the bones that indicate some of the people are not native to the area, and even some of the animals aren't native to the area. They were brought in from another place with different strontium counts in their diet. And then most recently, and this is this summer, Rachel Simpson, PhD student at the University of Alberta, has been analyzing teeth using a synchrotron, measuring the lead in the teeth and why there is so much lead in some of the teeth. Well, like all of the teeth there is something that's still being investigated. Well, there are many, many other stories to tell about the city, but I've gone on long enough now, and I'll leave you not with a traditional sunset, but with a sunrise over Lake Stymphalos. Thank you very much.
Hector, thank you so much. What a fantastic journey through all of your work there. And I said you have wide interests, and also as you said, there's some real groundbreaking stuff when some of these techniques were only being thought about in Greece for archaeology. Some of the remote sensing and the resistivity work and things like that. So thank you. I'm conscious of time, and everyone just checking all the chat and the comments. So David Blackman, thank you very much for your sorry, let me control this. David, okay, sorry, waiting to ask you a question about the harbour. So I think David will be keen to reconnect. Let me just go over to the Q&A as well, because I think there were a question from William quite about halfway through, Hector, was what got you interested in this particular site in the first place? Was it just it hadn't been looked at? Was it when you went there first of all?
It hadn't been looked at, and I knew of its existence, but I'd never been there. But Madame Hasia was elderly. She was probably only 60, but when you're 23, that's elderly. I'm 79 now. She wanted to go, so we drove up at 5 in the morning so she could get the photograph gone over Lake Stymphalos. While she was taking her pictures, I wandered around and noticed the parch marks and the orthogonal plan of the city. And that was then I decided I wanted to dig there someday. Ironically, I got a job at the University of British Columbia just as we were beginning excavations in rough Cilicia, Asia Minor,
Okay.
and Amurium. So I spent the next decade working there, but then fortunately became the director of the Canadian Archaeological Institute at Athens in 1981 for 3 years, set up its facilities and got its projects going, which were Stymphalos and Mytilene.
Amazing.
Fortunately, we had good relations with people at the Archaeological Society, and we did a synargasia with them. And John Travlos was our synargatis, and it was very generous of them. And we continue to have support. Vasily Petrakos was great, both here and when we started work at Mytilene, where he'd been Ephor in the late 60s.
Of course.
And gave me copies of all his publications and whatnot about him. So that was
that's got you started. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hope I'll find a colleague to take over the site.
Indeed. And thank you, Hector, and thank you for your question, William. Nick Service. So Nick just was interested in other references to Stymphalos in ancient literature. Nicholas said he knew about the reference to the mercenaries and Xenophon's 10,000, etc. But what about other references in ancient literature? Are there any off the top of your head, Hector, you recall?
Only a handful. There's a reference in Polybius, I think it's book 4, book 5, to a man called Euripides of Euripidas, form of the name Euripides, who was an Aeolian, who passed by there in the late 3rd century during the wars with Philip V of Macedon. But that is
wow, how
about
fascinating.
it. And he wasn't Stymphalian, he just was in the area.
He just happened, yes.
Yeah. So no, it's
not many. Yeah.
There's not many. I mean, we found remains of 4 hoplite shields, which I'm writing up for Jerry's next volume on the sanctuary. But they're very difficult to pin down. They use the same kind of shield for 300 years.
Fascinating. Question from David. Sorry, David, I saw your question you're in the Q&A now. Hector, do we know anything about a harbour at Stymphalos? None mentioned by Lehman Hartleben, David says.
No, well, Lehman Hartleben only dealt with ocean harbours, I think, or maybe a few river harbours. The lake dries up all the time. It's only 2 meters deep. You could practically wade across it much of the year. There were probably small fishing boats, but nothing that would require
nothing. Like a major harbour works.
I'm afraid no harbors up there.
No harbors.
Lots of undiscovered ones along the coast, though, I'm sure.
That's undoubtedly true. There's just a couple more, Hector, in the Q&A. Apart from saying a fantastic talk, thank you, William. What book would you recommend as a general introduction to the Hellenistic world? Sorry, a broader question, Hector.
Oh goodness!
I'm just trying to think myself now as well.
Well, I'm showing my age, but William Tarn, who was a banker turned academic in the 1930s, but things have moved on far from there. There are a lot of books on the Hellenistic world. I think Graham Shipley has one.
And also I'm just thinking, I suppose it depends if William, I don't know if you have any particular geographical focus as well. I suppose we can because there are a number. I'll turn around and look at my bookshelf here where all my wife Thalia, my wife who did her doctorate on that period more than me. I was doing much earlier period. So if I had more time, William, I should have looked in advance at your question and I could have got some off the shelf here. But well, we'll try and come back to you, William, or feel free to drop me a line and I'll come back to you with an answer if that's okay. So I'll show I've been out of archaeology and classics for a little while now. And Stephanie Savage, thank you very much. Apart from saying great talk. Hector, a question. And Stephanie said, I was wondering if there's any evidence for Elithia being an epithet for Artemis or some sort of double barrel cult name.
Not as far as I know.
Mm.
Jerry Shouse, who may be online watching this, would be able to give a more certain answer. But as far as I know, no, it was strictly Eleutheria
Mm.
by herself. But things get very complicated in the later you go in the late classical
Yes.
and Hellenistic world with the syncretism of different divinities. At Mytilene, we find Sanctuary of Demeter and Cori suddenly acquires Cybele
Yes.
at some point in the 3rd century in the sanctuary. Things are a lot more complicated in the ancient world than they were when I was a student 60 years ago. All of this work on network theory now, some of which is very hypothetical, but some of which points directions that one might profitably investigate
Yeah.
are there.
No, no, thank you, Hector. And I'm conscious of time, so I'll probably David. Then perhaps this is the last little comment and question. So David Blackman's asked follow-up question. A very specific one, Hector? Does the water level vary from year to year?
Oh yes, the water level, it never goes deeper than about 2 meters, but some years the entire lake disappears. And the village people call it the aerodromio, the airport, because you could land a plane on it, although not with the number of reeds there are now. So the Catabothra, the exits from the lake, were blocked in the late 19th century to raise the water level to send water to the Corinthia, and that is and then more of that is going on. The new plundering of the water of the valley, you can see where my sympathies lie, is going into the water table, into artesian wells and taking water up. But one of the problems there with the growth of the reeds is the extensive use for the last 50 years of phosphate fertilizer. It's good for the crops, but it washes into the lake and causes the reeds to grow like mad.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, thank you. As I say, I'm conscious of time, so if I may, I think we've got through all the questions, Flora. So I think I've managed that, and I know we've gone a little bit over, but just to say, Hector, I just want to say a massive thank you. A number of comments in the chat and everything saying what a great talk. Very, the rich illustrations. You've given us such a visual picture of so many interesting different elements. Just for all of you still on the call, I know numbers we were on the call because apologies we've overrun, but I wanted to do full justice to this as well. But Hector, and thank you again. Just to say to everyone, Laura's put in the chat again, if you would like to and you feel able to make a small donation, it always helps the school. We'd be massively grateful. Hector has done this today. All of the people in the series do these as just as an offer to support the school. So if you can make a similar small offer, that would be amazingly gratefully received as well. And Flora, you asked me to mention the next one, if I may, as well, which in November. So we're here at towards the end of September now, and it's going to be a real pleasure to have the hybrid talk both in London, physically in Senate House, and also online from John Davis on reimagining ancient Greek landscapes, which I guess, Hector, you've helped us do a little bit as well as a warm-up for that as well, and reimagine it in so many different ways, fascinating on the different cults, fascinating on what is visible and not visible, as you said, and just some really unusual things that really surprised you over all that journey of the discovery. So, as I say, Hector, it's been lovely to see you. Thank you so much for doing this, and
thank you so much.
Yeah, and a pleasure,
Thanks.
a pleasure, and thank you everyone for dialing in as well. And feedback welcome always to Flora or myself as well. But Hector, a real pleasure.
A pleasure for me too.
Thank you.
Bye
Thank you very much.
Bye.